A jack of all trades is a master of none. We've all heard that one before, and it's no wonder when our culture is so chock full of messages that all boil down to this one famous saying. For instance, take the 10,000 hour rule, which says that the way to achieve world-class mastery is to sink 10,000 hours of so-called deliberate practice into honing a skill. Or how about something like grit, which the psychologist who popularized it as the key to lasting success describes as a combination of perseverance and passion in striving toward a singular goal. The basic idea seems to be that the secret to doing well in life is picking one thing and sticking with it. And that anyone who doesn't decide to grind away at becoming an expert at just one thing is doomed to eternal mediocrity and unfulfillment. The thing is just that for some of us, finding that one thing to fixate on feels a little bit like this.
Only one! The end!
Yeah, it sucks. So this led me to wonder, where did this laser focus on specialization come from? For reasons we'll get into later, I had a feeling that it hadn't always been this way. So what changed? And why? And what do you do if picking just one thing feels like dying a bit inside? Or, I guess, being devoured by a high-strung lemon dude? Armed with history, and way too many articles from the furthest corners of the internet, I decided to find out if the only choice really is to specialize or die. Welcome to Armchair Alchemy. I'm the Armchair Alchemist. As you can see, the only seating I have access to right now is this serviceable office chair. I do believe that one day I will ascend to full armchair status, but for now, please forgive the false advertising, and let's dive into today's topic. The age at which school kids are expected to start specializing is different everywhere, but in the secret European country that I grew up in, it starts in high school. There's a small core curriculum that everyone takes, but by the age of 16, you've essentially picked a major, and that major is going to determine what you can later study at university. I chose to specialize in languages, but in exchange, I had to opt out of all but the most basic math and science courses. Even though I'd chosen to prioritize the subjects I loved the most, I'd always really liked this particular satisfaction that comes from solving a tricky math problem, so losing the sciences kind of bummed me out. But I quickly noticed that most of my classmates did not feel the same way. A significant number of them had chosen this major not because they wanted to study the humanities, but because they felt intimidated by math, and they wanted to take as little of it as possible. So after high school, I started a bachelor's degree in a humanities subject, and for various reasons that I won't get into here, it kind of sucked. Actually, it sucked enough that I decided to totally change paths and switch my course of study to STEM. Since this was a total 180, it required me to put in another year to take all of that math and physics and chemistry that I had missed out on in high school. And I relished it. I was finally getting to absorb all of this knowledge that I had been locked out of. But once I made it into my actual STEM undergrad, I started seeing the same pattern as I had in high school, only the other way around. Non-technical subjects that were focused on writing or on social sciences were the most widely despised by my new set of classmates. And making fun of the fluff that was taught in non-science courses was like the cheapest and easiest way for these STEM students to bond over some kind of shared identity. So what I'm getting at here is that if your interests span both the natural and the social sciences, and if you're equally fascinated by math and music, and you love writing both commentary and code, there's no real natural niche for you in today's world. Of course, this is going to vary somewhat by country, but even in countries that have a broad liberal arts education, like the United States, where incidentally, you have to put yourself in eternal debt in order to get that broad education, education, but that's another topic. Specialization sets in by the time that you start working. In general, disciplines are split down fault lines that very few people seem interested in crossing. The British writer and chemist C.P. Snow famously described this in his 1959 lecture on the two cultures. Snow was in the unique position of being a scientist by training and a writer by vocation, so he came into contact with people from both groups. And unfortunately, this left him with a kind of an unflattering impression. I believe the intellectual life of the whole of Western society is being increasingly split into two polar groups. Literary intellectuals at one pole, at the other, scientists. Between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, hostility and dislike, but most of all, lack of understanding. Snow goes on to describe how the two groups almost make it a point of pride that they never engage with the domain of the other side. So the scientists don't care much about literature or art because they find it irrelevant to their interests, and the literary intellectuals are convinced that they hold the keys to true high culture, so they don't need to bother with mundane things like thermodynamics or acceleration. In my personal anecdotal experience, as we've already heard, this is generally true. Like Snow, I've moved between both groups, and I've always felt like I needed to silence one part of myself, no matter where I was. There was no context where all of my interests were considered equally valuable. There was no choice of study or career where it seemed possible to embrace the fact that I liked and that I was pretty good at basically everything. In fact, everywhere we look, specialization seems to rule. Every step forward is about narrowing down focus, about finding that thing that we want to spend our 10,000 hours practicing. So about a year ago, desperate to escape the one-sidedness of my new major, I signed up for an evening class in the history of ideas. Because, there's no antidote to being fed up with school like more school. As I was learning about the past, I noticed that a lot of the great figures of history seemed to exist in a cultural context where it was okay or even encouraged to be interested in everything. These people are what we might call polymaths, individuals with great learning in multiple fields of study. The most famous polymath is undoubtedly Leonardo da Vinci, artist, architect, inventor, and natural scientist, painter of the world's most famous smirk, doodler of cool steampunk-looking wings, and dissector of dead bodies for fun and profit. Also, possibly a part-time Ninja Turtle? There's also Aristotle, who wrote the foundational Western texts in politics, rhetoric, logic, biology, ethics, and more. There was Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, who was a political counselor and a physician and a philosopher and an astronomer, and Benjamin Franklin, who was a statesman, scientist, printer, author, inventor, and cover boy of the $100 bill. How was this possible? How come no one ever told these people that it's more satisfying to stick with just one thing that you can get really good at? Or that they had to pick a single area of interest in order to get a good job under late-stage capitalism? Or whatever. Obviously, something had changed, and it's time to find out what. Florence in the 15th century. This was the peak of the Italian Renaissance, and nothing embodied this era's humanist worldview like the uomo universale, the universal man. He, because, yes, it was a he, was the ideal toward which everyone, or at least all he's, should strive. Renaissance humanists believed that human beings had limitless capacity for development. In their search for answers to fundamental existential questions, they saw it as their duty to embrace knowledge in all fields in order to live up to their ultimate potential. A man can do all things if he will, said Leon Battista Alberti, and he meant it. He was an architect, painter, classicist, poet, scientist, and mathematician. Another great humanist teacher named Vittorino da Feltre was of the opinion that the perfect man should be able to discuss natural philosophy, ethics, the motion of the stars, geometry, harmony, arithmetic, and surveying. surveying. But as prominent as this ideal was during this time, it wouldn't last. According to the World History Encyclopedia, inevitably, humanist scholars and thinkers began to divide into groups as they specialized into different areas of what was already a hopelessly broad area of human endeavor. As science, the arts, history, philosophy, and theology all split away from each other, so Renaissance humanism came to an end, broken apart as scholarly specialization won the battle against earning a comprehensive overview of the human condition. In his 2020 book, The Polymath, British historian Peter Burke looks into the reasons why the universal ideal fell out of fashion, and why specialization eventually became the dominant paradigm. A major reason, according to Burke, was that, starting in the Renaissance, the amount of available information grew exponentially. In a pre-disciplinary epoch, or in a period such as the Middle Ages in which only a few academic disciplines existed, there might seem to be little need for a concept such as polymath. Wide-ranging curiosity was normal at this time, and might even be described as the default setting. Since there was less to know than would become the case from the Renaissance onwards, it was possible, with a mighty effort, to master at least the dominant forms of knowledge. But by the 17th century, universal knowledge was firmly out of reach of any one individual. This was the result of several developments. The arrival of the printing press made it possible to produce and disseminate books at previously unimaginable rates, compared to when manuscripts had to be painstakingly copied out by hand. European colonization and exploitation of other parts of the world led to a huge number of new discoveries being made and exchanged by Westerners, and channels of communication like postal networks were expanding, which allowed for correspondence between thinkers and the spread of news sheets and journals. Specialization, Burke says, became a kind of defense mechanism against this deluge of information. Since the 1600s, there have been several more knowledge explosions. In the 19th century, technological developments made printing books even cheaper. And of course, in recent history, the internet has blown the volume of available knowledge out of all comprehensible proportion. Before we can catch back up with our own times, let's stay for a moment in the 18th century, where an important new idea is about to enter the scene: the division of labor. The division of labor is often credited to Adam Smith, who is also known as the Big Daddy of capitalism. In his 1776 treatise, The Wealth of Nations, Smith presents the idea that by dividing labor into smaller and smaller tasks performed by more and more specialized workers, productivity will skyrocket. So the quintessential example of this is factory assembly lines, but it applies to knowledge work as well. As Smith said, each individual becomes more expert in his own peculiar branch, more work is done upon the whole, and the quantity of science is considerably increased by it. Smith considered the division of labor to be an inevitable consequence of a civilized society, and so far history has proven him right. By the 19th century, specialization was firmly in place. New institutions and academic societies were popping up, representing increasingly narrow disciplines. And according to Burke, scholars prone to many-sidedness were being criticized more frequently than ever before. They were described as dabblers with excessive ambitions, who were curious about too many things at once. During this time, there was also a shift in meaning of the terms dilettante and amateur. Both originally had positive connotations, referring to a person who delighted in or loved something. But in the course of the 19th century, these terms became pejorative, denoting not enthusiasm, but the superficial understanding associated with non-specialists. And these are the attitudes that remain with us today. An article in The Economist titled "The Last Days of the Polymath" explains how specializing is necessary, not only to thoroughly understand your topic, but in order to speak with authority, to be taken seriously. Researchers who are interested in going across departments are excluded or kicked out of modern institutions. They aren't contributing fully to any one field, and even if their knowledge of several different disciplines might eventually lead to some kind of huge breakthrough, the universities want the day-to-day focus to remain in just one field. Another think piece points out that status in academia hinges on publishing in journals, so researchers are incentivized to make tiny incremental discoveries in order to get published. Spreading yourself across multiple departments, trying to see the big picture, just isn't a feasible way to make it in a career that's so focused on the minutiae and the nitty-gritty. The last days of the polymath wraps up with this reflection by the author. Polymaths were the product of a particular time when great learning was a mark of distinction and few people had money and leisure. Their moment has passed, like great houses or horse-drawn carriages. The world may well be a better place for the specialization that has come along instead. The pity is that progress has to come at a price. Civilization has put up fences that people can no longer leap across. A certain type of mind is worth less. Yeah, that's true. It's not my intention to idealize the past because education has become more accessible than ever across lines of gender and social status, and that is unequivocally a good thing. At the same time, part of me mourns the fall of the uomo universale. He seemed like a pretty cool guy, and yet he's gone from being exalted to an object of scorn. So there we are, caught back up with the modern world, and things are looking bleak for anyone with wide-ranging interests. The writer David Epstein sums up the state of affairs like this. We are often taught that the more competitive and complicated the world gets, the more specialized we all must become, and the earlier we must start to navigate it. Our best-known icons of success are elevated for their precocity and their head starts. Mozart at the keyboard, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg at the other kind of keyboard. The response in every field to a ballooning library of human knowledge and an interconnected world has been to exalt increasingly narrow focus. Oncologists no longer specialize in cancer, but rather in cancer related to a single organ, and the trend advances each year. Surgeon and writer Atul Gawande pointed out that when doctors joke about left ear surgeons, we have to check to be sure they don't exist. This quote is from Epstein's book, Range: How Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. This book is basically a 300-page debunking of the idea that specialization is the only way to succeed, and I can really recommend it to anyone who's interested in this topic. It's got a lot of fascinating stories that I won't go into in detail here because you should read it to find out. And yes, this is the part where we start seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. I scoured the internet for contemporary opinions on generalism and polymathy, and it turns out that all may not be lost. The 10,000-hour rule that we mentioned at the beginning said that deliberate practice was the key to honing a skill. And what that means is that you aren't just checking out and passively grinding away at practicing this thing, but you're actively using feedback to correct any mistakes in your technique. But it turns out that the effectiveness of this depends on what kind of activity we're talking about. For kind learning environments, where patterns repeat and feedback is accurate and rapid, think activities like chess, poker, or golf, deliberate practice actually does work. But there's a flip side. What's known as wicked learning environments. As Epstein explains, in wicked domains, the rules of the game are often unclear or incomplete. There may or may not be repetitive patterns, and they may not be obvious, and feedback is often delayed, inaccurate, or both. In this type of scenario, extreme specialization via deliberate practice may be far less effective at improving performance. And by the way, the 10,000-hour rule has also been disproven in like a million other ways, but I'll leave the details as an exercise to the viewer. Also, the narrower and kinder the task, the more likely it is that a computer can learn to do it. Take the progress of artificial intelligence in learning to play chess. The AIs left humans behind a long time ago. But in the messier world of, say, driving cars, they're still struggling. In a truly open world problem, devoid of rigid rules and reams of perfect historical data, Epstein writes, AI has been disastrous. In the articles that I've read, automation by computers and AI has been a recurring theme. While the threat of AIs taking over our jobs is probably somewhat overblown, several sources do point out that the human trait that's most resistant to automation is the ability to integrate broadly, to make connections between apparently unrelated domains and synthesize new knowledge from that. For example, the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded for integrating ideas from psychological research into economic science. Models from economics tend to assume a high degree of rationality, but the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman took into account the unpredictability and nuance of actual human decision-making. So basically, understanding the impulse that makes us buy yet another cat mug even though we already have 4 of them can win you a prestigious award. Fun fact. Speaking of Nobel laureates, studies show that scientists who win the Nobel Prize are much more likely to be amateur singers, dancers, or actors than the average scientist. The more widely recognized a scientist is, the higher the chances that they have some sort of creative or aesthetic interest outside of their narrow research domain. It appears as though they're scattering and dissipating their energies, said Santiago Ramon y Cajal, the father of modern neuroscience, while in reality, they are channeling and strengthening them. There are more advantages to cross-pollinating seemingly unrelated areas. An article in The Observer suggests that going broad instead of deep makes it easier to break through in fields where there's little competition, simply because they're so rare. Even if you're merely competent rather than an expert in your handful of different fields, the combination of those skills might be unique to you. The article mentions Scott Adams, the creator of the comic Dilbert. Adams wasn't the funniest person in the world, and he wasn't the best cartoonist, nor the most experienced employee. But by using his illustration skills to make a funny comic strip about business culture, he found a niche where he was uniquely prepared to excel. The point is that being interested in many things might not mean that you're doomed to a life of failure and dissatisfaction. Instead, having curiosity and range could be the key to getting your slice of the success pie. Despite these persistent cultural messages we're being fed, excellence is not just for the specialists. The Jack can embrace all of his trades and still reach the stars. And that's exactly the good news that we wanted. Isn't it? All right, kids. It's time to debunk the debunking. What do all these arguments in favor of generalism seem to have in common? Let's take a look at them again. Generalism can protect your skill set from becoming obsolete in the age of AI. If you're a researcher, generalism can enable you to make cross-disciplinary discoveries that specialists are too narrowly focused to see. Or your varied abilities could unlock rare career areas where you are uniquely equipped to succeed. Are you seeing the same pattern that I did as I was researching this? The focus is always on career and on achievement. The assumption that seems to underlie all of this is that the goal of pursuing a skill or an area of knowledge is to excel. Whether that means achieving financial success or breaking new ground in the world of research, the strongest argument in defense of generalism is that it too has been documented as leading to world-class performance. Also, a staggering and truly depressing number of the articles I read give Elon Musk as the prime example of a modern-day polymath, and that's a red flag if I've ever seen one. Don't get me wrong here. I think it's admirable to strive for excellence, but at the same time, I resent the idea that something is only valuable or worthwhile if your plan is to become quote-unquote good at it. This implies that the worth of a pursuit is directly tied to the external value that it can generate for others who can somehow reward you for it. I think that today, this idea of generating value goes beyond work and really into every facet of our lives. Content creation is a viable job now. It's possible to monetize your hobbies or even your lifestyle. So the pressure we can find something to get good enough at to be noticed is arguably greater than ever. And where does that leave space for playfulness, exploration, and joy? For the answer to that, let's take a peek at the other category of sources I found. A lot of my research into this topic ended up yielding these very, very career-focused articles, but there was also content that focused more on how generalism feels from the inside.
I thought that I would eventually have to pick one thing, deny all of my other passions, and just resign myself to being bored. The other reason it caused me so much anxiety was a little bit more personal. I worried that there was something wrong with this, and something wrong with me for being unable to stick with anything. I worried that I was afraid of commitment, or that I was scattered, or that I was self-sabotaging, afraid of my own success. If you can relate to my story and to these feelings, I'd like you to ask yourself a question that I wish I had asked myself back then. Ask yourself where you learned to assign the meaning of wrong or abnormal to doing many things.
That was Emily Wapnick. She runs a community for what she calls multi-potentialites and wrote a book about it too, called How to Be Everything. But she wasn't the first one. Refuse to Choose by Barbara Sher and The Renaissance Soul by Margaret Lobenstein are two other basically self-help books for people who feel adrift and misunderstood because they have too many interests in a world that insists that they should just pick one. What's interesting is that these authors don't treat generalism as a choice, or perhaps more accurately as the inability to make a choice of education or career, but rather as a foundational personality trait. Kind of like the introvert-extrovert model, but for how we choose to engage with our interests rather than our social interactions. It's a spectrum, with generalists on one side and specialists on the other. All three of these writers, speaking as generalists, describe the same feeling of alienation and of defectiveness that I was talking about at the beginning of this video. The constant messaging from the world around us convinces people on the generalist side of the spectrum that we're flawed or even deliberately doing something wrong, even though it seems like we're just wired differently and wired the same way as Leonardo da Vinci or Benjamin Franklin. As we've seen, having broad interests used to be the ultimate ideal. So there's obviously nothing wrong with that in and of itself. The times just changed around us, and we're living in a world that for the past 200 plus years has been built for specialists. Margaret Lobenstein points out that we don't expect most people on the specialist side of the spectrum to be prodigies like Mozart. In that case, then generalists shouldn't need to be geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci to be valid in wanting to explore their many interests, right? Yet, so many of us face criticism from the outside and self-doubt from the inside because our preferences don't conform to the norm that's reflected in ideas like the 10,000 hour rule or grit. The norm that says that you should pick something and stick with it. Just look at the research of Angela Cotalesa. She interviewed modern polymaths, or people who had successful careers in both art and science, and she found that they needed high emotional resilience to pursue their interests in the face of external expectations, because we live in a society that tells us to specialize. And these are people who didn't do that. They forged their own path. Many people may lack the necessary self-possession to fight those norms. The same article points out that many children are actually fascinated by lots of different areas, but the structure of our education systems and employment pushes them to specialize. I think it's kind of similar to how we place a very high value on an outgoing personality, so more reserved people can end up faking it during job interviews because we pick up on what traits are considered desirable or good and which ones are maybe a bit less good. So as a result, we're often incentivized to fall into whichever pattern of behavior is rewarded, even when it goes against the grain of who we are. So what's my point? Basically, if you can relate to any of what I've been saying, if you enjoy trying something new every week, you have the right to indulge that. And you retain that right even if you never master any of those skills. Even if you never manage to combine them into a one-of-a-kind research area or monetizable content stream. I'm saying this because this is something that I've personally really struggled to believe. But I'm learning that it's okay to do stuff just for the hell of it, without imagining someone like standing over my shoulder, evaluating how it will advance my career or contribute to the common good. If honing a skill or striving for excellence brings you personal satisfaction, then by all means, go for it, do it, live your best life. But if the idea of needing to skill grind forever or else your personal worth is forfeit leads you to crushing performance anxiety, then it's also okay to just not. Pursuing your curiosity is worthwhile because it's enjoyable to you, and not just If you're aiming to change the world or make loads of money or future-proof your career against like the AI takeover or whatever, I think it is going to take the wider culture some time to catch up with this, both because it's just not the norm that we have right now and because the culture at large is so hyper-focused on this idea of career success as personal success. But I do hope that as generalists become more visible and share our life experiences, it'll become easier for us to just keep vibing to our own tune, even if it's not sanctioned by the folk wisdom of the times. If you've watched this far, thank you so much. This video got super long, but it is a topic that I'm really invested in, so I wanted to go down the rabbit hole of learning and sharing in excruciating detail. I'd love to hear from you in a comment. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What are your experiences with specialization and education and all of this stuff I've been chatting about? Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. You know how it works. You've been on YouTube before. And with all that said, I figure I would close this video with some wisdom from Barbara's share. I've come to believe you don't always have to use things you love, and it's not always so practical to be so practical. Now that I've grown up, I realize that all that delicious dilettantism pays its way as much as any degree in medicine or engineering by making me remember every day, whenever I pick up a book or watch the Science Channel or try to read a map of Asia for no particular reason, that life is amazing and there is no end to the wonder of it. Thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.